A warm welcome to Kawowo Sports on this cold morning in Kampala City. We have paid a visit to former Uganda Rugby Union President and current Rugby Africa Vice President, Mr. Andrew Owor, who has come to the end of his 4-year term at the helm of the continental body. Mr. Owor is no stranger to Ugandan rugby circles, he's not stranger to Rugby Africa circles, but for those that may not know the story behind the person, if you would tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I started my rugby in 1992. I've been involved in rugby for about 31 years now, but specifically schools rugby at the time. That's when I played schools rugby. I played for Uganda schools. At the time it was what they called a select schools and a select side. So we played against Zambia, we played against Kenya, and I captained that when I was there. Then of course I played club rugby. That was from about 98. I played for a variety of clubs actually. And then the national side. By 1999 I was playing for Uganda, and we had a World Cup qualifier. And then after that I went on to play for the Buffaloes and coached the Buffaloes rugby club. Played for the Heathens, I played for the Rhinos, I played for Impis. So that actually started my management career with Impis because I was the chair and president of the club at that time. That was way back in 1999. I then moved on to be Honorable Secretary of Chadondo Rugby Club, and then moved on to be the Vice Chairman of Chadondo Rugby Club, then Chairman. Eventually, from there, I moved on to be the President of Uganda Rugby Union, and then was elected to the position of Vice President of Rugby Africa. So I've been involved in management of rugby for over 24 years at different levels. So I know what it is to run a club at a university level, a club at a national level. I've run a union. I've been very much involved with the technical side on all those levels, and involved with the running of rugby on the continent for the last 4 years. So for me, it's been a journey. It's been where I started off, and my ambition was always to make a change. Because of that, I've thought long and hard, and because of that, I have decided to run for the position of President of Rugby Africa, and I have a very good plan and an agenda on what I want to achieve for Africa and what I want to change and make sure that we can see development at different levels in Africa.
24 years in management of rugby in Africa, and 4 of those spent at the helm of Rugby Africa as Vice President. How would you describe your 4 years in term of office?
The 4 years, it was tough. There was a lot of learning. First of all, when we took office, we then had the lockdown, COVID pandemic around the world, and so rugby naturally suffered a hit because it's a contact sport, and as such, we had to be very careful what we did. We had to put in very good protocols to make sure that we look after the player welfare. And so it was very challenging in that sense. And then, of course, there's the travel of players across the continent. It was sometimes a nightmare trying to get teams to where they should be, and then just making sure the games can be played, whether with or without an audience. So we actually went through a lot of thinking, a lot of look into our procedures to check whether our procedures are right. we met a lot of challenges, but I think we did not suspend any single event in that time. We managed to work closely with governments and to work closely with the unions to achieve these goals. So I think it was a success overall in that sense. So for me, the 4 years has been a lot of learning, and one of the key learnings is that there's a need for policy, there's a need for structure within Rugby Africa and within the possible areas we can try and help different unions.
Have announced that you're going to be running for president of Rugby Africa in the next cabinet, in the next executive committee, and that makes me pose a question. Why challenge the incumbent your president, with whom and under whom you've served in the previous term?
Well, I think we have slightly different management styles, slightly different ways of governance. I want to give Africa an opportunity to have a different way of doing things. I totally respect the president. He's been good at making sure we did what we did. I think certain targets are now ready for Africa to achieve, and those things are difficult to do if you are not in a position where you can make the change. So personally, I think for me it's not so much against him. I think it's more like giving an option. I'm giving Africa an option, and I'm very sure that if I took office, he would work with me.
There's a possible milestone, should you go through, of being Rugby Africa's first Anglophone president. There's a disconnect between the different regions of Africa, that is the Anglophone, the Arab Africa, and Francophone Africa. How will your term of office, how will you ensure that there's better representation across Africa to look, and not only to just look, but to work better for us all?
So first, we must see and look at Africa as different zones, and I'm saying zones because I would prefer to look at the different member countries based on, yes, geography is one of the things, but the other thing is just looking at their surroundings. Who is the economics? Who's got a strong economy in that area? So there are a number of parameters we need to look at, but the easier way to run this is to decentralize power. We've tried in the last 4 years very centralized kind of mechanism, but I think it's time for those different zones to be part of the management process, to be part of the exco, and about, if you want to call it that, and call it a council or whatever, but the management of Rugby Africa cannot continue to be a very centralized system, because that does not help us tap into the resource that is specific to different regions or parts of Africa, and tap into the governments that are willing to support those particular areas. And that's very key in my strategy and in working with people. It is going to be to work with what the interests of that particular group are, and make them achieve the best they can achieve within their zone. And I think that then builds into the Africa-wide competitions or Africa-wide strategy, and that then would build into the international competitions. So it is, there are about 3-4 areas that you need to work on at the same time, and make sure that they are growing within the zones and growing at an Africa level, and then you can raise the bar.
Right. Let's talk about competitions in Rugby Africa. In your view, Are the current Rugby Africa competitions, that's the Africa Men's and Women's Cup, the Africa Men's and Women's Sevens, the Africa Men's under / Boys under 20, and the others in the lower tier, in your view, are they commercially sustainable and competitive to a world standard?
Not yet. No. I think the Rugby Africa Cup is not commercially sustainable at the moment, and part of it is when you look at the following of that competition. In certain countries, there's huge following. There's huge following of teams in certain countries. But across the continent, if you look at the population of Africa being at about 1.2 billion, how many of them are related to rugby? How many of them are following the sport? I think we are way in the lower levels, and there needs to be a lot of work in building the product. And that's why I said the strategy is to go back to the zonal point, develop that, because the more you can develop the sport, the more you get a following. The more you can develop the sport in different zones, the more you improve the product at the top, because now you have more people consuming the sport, whether it's on social media or it's on TV. It doesn't matter. We need to reach more people, and that is going to be a core part of the commercial strategies. Is how do you create your communication structure such that you can get to the people who need to consume the sport, the young people in different areas who may or may not understand it, who may or may not have any exposure to the sport itself. So we need to reach them in very creative ways. It doesn't matter where you're sitting, there is work to be done in terms of getting people to consume the sport. And that is not a one-man job. You need the zones to be part of this process. You need the different communications people in the unions to be part of the process. And that's one of our strategies would be to do that, to reach out to those people and achieve it with it. It doesn't matter the language, but get the sport out there. And that's very important.
Just talked about Rugby Africa and how Rugby Africa Cups and how your plans to improve the cups. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Rugby Africa Cup needs to be elevated in terms of value. What value does it bring to the union? What value does it bring to a zone? What value does it bring to a corporate partner? What value does it bring to a government in that zone? And I think those questions we've not answered yet, and we need to have that conversation. We need to start looking at the particular answers for the different zones, and once we do that, then we need to sell rugby as a product. So the product itself needs some work. It needs to be improved, and then from there we shall begin to have a semblance of revenue that can trickle back towards the players and the unions. At the moment, our core funding is from World Rugby, and World Rugby has specific targets. We as a region, however, as Africa, have different targets as well. So we want to try and spread the game. We want to try and get development going at a very low level. Whilst the other groups are looking at a high performance level, a high level kind of rugby. So we must have different tiers, different strategies for each tier, and I've called them prepare, participate, and perform. So a team that is at the prepare stage, or a union that's at the prepare stage, is most likely a union that is happy to play once a year. And if you give them more than one game a year, they struggle. So if you look at it in that sense, that team is preparing to begin performance or begin participating. Then there are those unions that are already participating. They're in the participation stage. Those unions generally tend to want maybe 3 fixtures a year, 3 international fixtures a year, maybe 5 international fixtures a year. But also when they get to 3, 5, they struggle because the commercial model doesn't support it. They need to have more support within the country, more support from their government for them to have more games. So it's a trend now. So that's why I say the ones who are preparing, let's have a strategy for them to prepare. Those who are participating, let's have a strategy for them to participate. And then those who are performing already, those who are playing rugby at an Africa top level, so to speak, they also have different interests. You find that those are more interested in 7 to 9 or 11 fixtures in a season because they have depth, they've got very ambitious players, they've got ambition to get into a World Cup. So you find that slightly as you go each step, the demand increases on the union, the demand also increases on the competitions of Rugby Africa. And so we must align our competitions with those different tiers. And I think that's going to be a huge focus on the technical side, is how do you technically support the unions to get to the next level? What do they need to do? And it's not always money. I think the impression people might get is that you throw money at it and somehow it works. You can give a union $1 million and they will not know what to do with it. If they don't have a plan, if they don't have a strategy, they don't know what they're going to do in the year and the next year. So it's always good to run the two together. Make sure you're working with them, but at the same time start opening up income or revenue streams for the different unions and for the different zones. I think that's going to be key in the strategy.
I'd love to ask about the Rugby Africa Cup, especially last year's big elephant in the room. The Rugby Africa Men's Cup 2022 was hosted in France despite a major appeal from the unions and the majority of Africa against a decision that was fully backed by Rugby Africa, including yourself. With the benefit of hindsight now, do you think that was the right decision?
I think even coming to that decision was difficult. There was 50-50 in the room at the time. We felt it was not going to be successful, while there was others who felt it was going to be successful. I think the debate came around the financials with it. I think there has been since a tendency to think that the tournament was not successful. But I think it achieved its goals in certain areas and did not meet its targets in other areas. I don't think it was necessarily a good thing for us to do, but it built relationships. I think it did build relationships which we will tap into for years to come. So if there's anything that was its good side, but I don't think going forward it's a good strategy to have. I don't believe in it. I think it's important that we try and build our structures from within and grow that structure so that the structure internally can gain the right revenue to make the tournament bigger and better. I will not say it was a bad decision, but I will also say that we did not achieve everything we wanted to achieve with it. And as such, I think the learning is that we should try and avoid that as much as we can.
What then is the guarantee that such a decision will not be taken in the future?
I don't think anybody can guarantee anything. It's difficult to guarantee anything, but the decision was made by a vote at EXCO. Obviously, vote means some people were for it, some people were against it, but at the end of the day, democracy prevails, and you have to support that.
I'd like to ask specifically this time about women's rugby. What is your plan for women's rugby in Africa?
So women's rugby has grown in a sense. If you say 4 years ago, we had 4 teams play, and it was small little tournament in South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Madagascar. Ever since then, we've had 12 teams play, and there is another 4 or 5 teams that feel they were not given an opportunity to be part of it. So the senior rugby is growing. What's not there is the under 20 girls, which is the feeder to the whole process. So in my roadmap, the plan is to make sure that in 2 years we can get an under 20 girls competition running, and in 4 years get an under 18 competition running. So that's very key if we want to develop women's rugby, and then go on to actually start even the under 18 boys and under 18 girls. That's important as well, because then you begin to see the growth from a school's level into an international competition, and then go into the World Cup, the Junior Rugby World Cup. That's also an opportunity that we have not exploited very well as Africa. And yet we have so many young, talented players at that age that can compete with some of those nations out there.
For both men and women, Africa only has a single slot at the Rugby World Cup, that's Test Rugby. Do you think Africa deserves to have more African nations participating at the Rugby World Cup, and how can we ensure that we get to that level?
Yes, for sure. Africa needs or should look into more slots at a World Cup. But the slots at the World Cup, there is a process. We must perform. We must show performance. So the teams we send to a World Cup must win. South Africa obviously is usually doing very well. We now must get the next groups winning. And once that happens, you begin to get more slots. Then we can avoid the repechage. But even at the repechage, we must go and perform, But it's not going to happen by mistake. We must improve the structure within the continental competitions so that the teams that play in the repechage, that play in the World Cup, get good competition and enough competition. By way of example, a team in Europe will play in the region of 12 to 16 test games in a year, all right? Our teams in Africa are playing 5 test games if they are very lucky, if they can, get there. But if we can improve that to give our teams 9 test games, all right, then we begin to get close to the level of test game. But as that grows, it also grows with the structure of the game within that country. And that's the thing that needs to happen. So if we do that, we will enhance performance. Once we enhance performance internally, then we can be sure whichever team we send, doesn't matter where it comes from, as long as it has been part of that structure, it has played 9 to 12 test games every year before a World Cup or before a repechage. That alone will show the difference. And that's what should be our target in Rugby Africa, is making sure these teams get good competition and a lot of it. And as I said, those are the performing teams. It doesn't mean that the lower ranks should not play. They play according to where they are. And then the top guys must be playing competitively enough rugby to compete with the other regions, so that when they play, they do perform. And then you can start arguing for more slots. At the moment, we can't argue slots because of our performance. And to build that performance, we must give our players more opportunities to grow. And that's why it's important to concentrate on the local, the zonal, and the Africa Cup structures.
Let's talk about club competitions. As it stands, Africa does not have a continental club competition pitting the leading teams from the different nations against each other. Why?
It is in the strategy. We want to look at some of those competitions. I call them commercial private competitions because it's not necessarily the mandate of Rugby Africa to look into club rugby, but it's important for a zone, for example. Between Uganda and Kenya, there was the Bamburi series. There used to be the Enterprise Cup in the old days. And those tournaments improved the performance of clubs within the East African region. I think it's important that we must understand that the clubs will not have a lot of funding to try and do cross-continental competition. But cross-border zonal competitions for clubs would be a way to go. And so it's on the agenda to try and build that. I call them accredited competitions, because we would still want those competitions to be run by those clubs or by those unions, but with a certain supervisory role of Rugby Africa. I think it's important for that to be a middle ground for the players who've played club rugby but are not yet at an international level. There will be a middle ground for them to get, yet again, another level of rugby. Again, you must compare club rugby in Africa and club rugby in another region. Any club side in Africa is playing, if we are lucky, 10, 18 games in a season, 15 games. Whereas when you look at the same level of player in another region, they're playing 30 to 36 games. So that shift makes a difference. And then when you look at the player who comes from that setup after playing 30, 36 games within the club, they go and play 12 test games. Then you can see the difference in performance. So again, we must go down to that level. We must get the unions to support that structure. But it's a conversation. And remember that does not apply in every part of Africa. It doesn't. We have to find a different way to do it in different places. But the principle would be that you create a middle ground where those players who are not playing for the national side but are very good at club level have that middle ground. And it will be different wherever you go. But the principle would remain the same. So yes, it is in the strategy to build those accredited competitions, which would be, in some cases, club competition, in some cases, franchise rugby competitions. But it must be done at a zonal level. It cannot, at African level, it's at the moment, it will be a huge financial ask for any club to try and do it.
There is a ready and fertile market for rugby, especially rugby sevens, in the globe and on the continent. Would the idea of an African Seven series to tap into this market be a good one, especially to boost the performance of African nations in the Challenger Series and the World Series, but also for the Olympic competitions?
Yes, absolutely. It is in my strategy. after 2 years to start that. Why 2 years? Because the first step is to build a zonal structure. The only way you're going to do a series is when you have a strong or leadership within the zone, so that you can then have a competition in one zone, another competition in another zone, and so forth. And so in the first year, we are trying to build that zonal structure with the aim that that zonal structure can also develop its own sevens. Then the way the series would make sense is when you take your core teams, if you call them your core teams, whatever the number is, and they fly into a zone, and the zonal winners, the teams that have won in the zone, join that competition. And so you then take points at the end of a set of series. So whether we can start with 2, 3, or make sure every zone hosts every year of, I think that's going to depend on the readiness of the zones. If the zones are already financially, structure-wise to host, then yes, I think we go ahead and have 4, 5, 6 different series across the continent. This is what's happening in other regions. So it's important that we try and build that. But it has a financial implication. And the financial implication means we must start from year 1 trying to sell the product. And by the time you've created the zones, you will have this as part of your strategy within the zones. And so that you can achieve that at the end of 2-year cycle or 3-year cycle. So it is in the strategy, but it's because of the financial implication around it. As much as there are fewer players in the sevens team, there are many more teams. So you find that smallest, if you're having a 12-team competition, you're looking at 180 people in one weekend. And so you must prepare yourselves financially, and you must prepare yourselves structure-wise to manage this number of people. So there is going to be a lot of effort on that in the first year and the second year, in order to build into that series competition, possibly in the third year to come. If we can achieve it earlier, then it means that the zones are ready and they are good to go. I think we shall maybe achieve that with some areas, but maybe not all. So it's always important to be a bit open to that, but a 7 series structure is very key to us developing our sevens culture within Africa. It's also easier for some unions to participate in sevens than to participate in 15s. And so it would be their choice. But the idea is that we provide a platform for it at a zone level and at the continental level. And that would still be the qualification pathway for going to the Olympics or going to the World Cup or going to the HSBC series. I think World Rugby has changed its format as well. And that feeds into the process to say that before you go and play trying to achieve series qualification, you should have played a number of tournaments within Africa. It's all about game time. And once you've created that, then players play at zonal level, play at continental level, then play in the Challenger Series, and then go on to play in the HSBC. And so you're going to produce players who are performing well if you do that. So it's the only way to do it is actually decentralize those competitions and create a series from there. But it's going to be a lot of work in the first beginning to prepare those zones adequately for that.
One of the key points that sticks out in our discussion today is the finances and the financial implications, the financial impact, or how much is needed to get these competitions going to get Rugby Africa running, but then also to get the strategy that you have in mind rolling. If you could please share with us to a bit of some detail where Rugby Africa stands financially in terms of our commercially viable products, in terms of our incomes and revenues, and any other income streams that the federation has.
So Rugby Africa's core funding comes from World Rugby. There's a bit of membership fees, but that's not really significant amount of funding. We run a budget of about 1.8 to 2 million euro or 2 million pounds, sorry, and that is not anywhere near enough to run these competitions. Even in the scaled down version of, say, the Africa Cup, whilst we would put 600,000 pounds towards it, it's not enough. It's simply not enough for teams to fly across the continent. It's not enough for teams to be hosted in relatively good hotels. It's not enough for you to achieve a certain standard. And so it's first of all to say that Rugby Africa does not run on a deficit. It only spends money that it receives. So we don't borrow. That's the first thing. And then the next thing is to say that how can we now double that income? We're not going to double it by going to say, listen, World Rugby, double your budget. They have to look after 6 different regions, and we are just one of them. So we can negotiate. There is always a negotiation process, and we've done it over the last 4 years, and we actually were able to have about a 30% increment from what we had 4 years ago. But that took a lot of pushing. It takes a lot of conversations, a lot of justification to make sure that you are spending the money in the right target areas. But then that's why I say that your strategy cannot be to sit and wait for World Rugby. We must generate income. And to generate income, you cannot generate, there's no big system that's going to do it. You're going to have to do it dependent on where you are in the continent. And then you're going to have a strategy that every event you have within those different areas generates enough to sustain those zones, to sustain those unions. And by doing that, you release or you relieve yourself of some of the expenditure at the top. So the core thing here is to partner with the right people. I think we've not spent a lot of time partnering with governments, but I think the learning from the last 4 years during lockdown is that governments did support us in many ways. But we have to find a way of tapping into that resource because they are willing and they want to be involved, but we must tap into that resource. So there is tapping into the different partners. There will be commercial partners that are not interested in cutting across Africa. So we need to have conversations with them about where their interest is in that zone, because that creates a source of income for that zone. It's going to be conversations with people we already know, people we are already working with at a union level, already working with at continental level. So it's a multiple prone strategy. You cannot, it's possible to go and try and look for partners outside Africa to come into Africa. But again, what value are we providing them? We must build that product so that the return on investment for them, it makes sense. And again, it depends on the industry in which they are. You see, if it's it's the banking industry, there's again a lot of diversity there. If you look at the alcohol industry or the beer breweries, that is very vibrant in parts of Africa. But there are parts of Africa where that is not acceptable. And you must then be sensitive to that. So you cannot copy-paste that model. You must look for something, another industry that is attracted towards the sport in that area. So it's a very complex kind of 360 angle you have to look at and say, whatever I do has to have a component of a commercial income that builds back. And then whatever income you make, a component of it is going towards development, because the guys at the prepare stage need a lot more support and they may not have any commercial value to offer at that time. So it is to split that into those little components and say, okay, this is roughly how much budget I can provide for development in this area. And this is roughly what I can provide in that area. And so the commercial strategy has to touch a lot of areas. And yes, we need to almost triple our budget if we are to try and meet the demands of Rugby Africa.
So, if I may ask, why should the government that you've mentioned, why should an individual that's interested, why should a private company that's interested invest in African rugby, in Rugby Africa, but then also in the different zones within which they exist?
So the first thing about investment in rugby is if you really want to develop people, rugby is the right sport because of its values. If you look at what rugby brings to children, it brings to schools a certain level of the values we bring to that. It's important that we ride on that. So if somebody wants to invest in Africa and they want to invest in the people, then rugby is the right sport. That said, we must also be very sensitive to the fact that at a zonal level or at a union level, there will be limitations on what to sell. And that's why the first bit is to try and create that exposure of the sport to more people, to more people consuming the sport. If more people are consuming the sport, you begin to derive value for that sport. You begin to have people interested in using your platform to reach the people they want to reach. So that's one of the ways, is to say, okay, the sport is grown, it's got a following, and for that reason, we want to invest in that. So you almost want to say your partnership has 3-4 different angles to it. You've got just a simple plain old, I want to develop people. Then you've got, I want to tap into a particular group of people. And then you've got the fact that success breeds success. So you want to tap into the success stories of those unions or those places. And so when you look at it from that end, we cannot sit with the same answer all through, but a general answer to say these are the areas we shall focus on, and those areas will brew some results in terms of the commercial value. Partners that we work with already and financial institutions that we need to work with. I think there's a broad list there of things to do, but again, very focused depending on where you are. So to me it's the people that you're trying to reach, and we must be a conduit for the investor to reach their target market, a conduit for them to reach a target community, and we are in every community, or we can be in every community, and I think that's important.
In a nutshell, as we conclude, why should Rugby Africa give you the mandate to steer continental rugby for the next 4 years?
I would like, yes, first of all, it's the program that we put together. That's the major reason why I'm involved in this. It's personally, I have, as I said, 24 years of managing rugby at the most basic level to a continental level, making decisions alongside different partners, working with people of different types and different interests, different organizations. So I have a set of skills that not many people have, because I do work with people of different age groups, and I work with people of different language, and we get along. I get along with people in all sorts of areas, and that's going to be very key in bringing Africa together, because of my set of skills of working with different people regardless of who they are. I think that's for me is going to be a major plus for Africa. That said, not a single person has got all the skill sets, and that's why my strategy is to involve as many people with the right interest of developing rugby, even if their interest is specific to a particular zone, involve them in the management process, because that just builds the profile of Rugby Africa. Of course, we have to be very sensitive to the image of the organization, but it's going to be a lot of work. That's the truth, and what Africa needs is somebody very vibrant, somebody who's spent his life building structures and keeping them and making sure they carry on, and that's really what Africa needs at the moment, and just a slightly different perspective to how things work for the continent.